aspirations?
No, I don't. I have been very blessed to serve in a number of positions in the government, including what George Shultz once called the best job in government, that's Secretary of State, and he was absolutely right about that. But over the years, as I've been asked whether I might run for this or run for that, I've always come down on the fact that the time just wasn't right. And pretty soon I started to saying to myself, well, maybe the time just isn't going to be right. And I think it's really not in me. I don't have that kind of fire in the belly. I have a lot of respect for people who do run for office, but I think it's frankly not for me.
What do you want to talk about?
I'm going to talk about the challenges that we face. I am going to remind people that today's headlines and history's judgment are rarely the same, and that it's extremely important to focus on essentials and the key elements of successful policy for the future, because history has a long arc, not a short one. And I'll have a chance to talk about some of those challenges, defending the country, the challenge of dealing with global financial and economic crisis, continuing to promote democracy, which the United States stands for and must stand for, as well as some of our challenges at home, because as a country that has strong values and strong principles, that's how we lead. We lead on the basis of those values and principles. And so I'm looking forward to an opportunity to talk about some of those challenges and dilemmas, but also about the way that we need to address them as an optimistic people and an optimistic country, because I really do believe, after many years of traveling the world, that the United States of America is fortunate to have the world's most optimistic people as its population.
How has the transition gone from you as Secretary of State to Secretary Clinton currently?
Well, the transition was very smooth. First of all, I have known Hillary Clinton since she brought her freshman daughter to Stanford when I was provost at the university. So we have known each other a very long time. We knew each other during the time that she was in the Senate. I have enormous respect for her. I think she's a patriot. I think she's a very sound person. And we were determined to have a very smooth transition. President Bush and then President-elect Obama were determined to have a smooth transition. And so that's how we conducted it. The State Department is also fortunate to have a very capable civil service, the Foreign Service, career service. And those people provide continuity in ways that some agencies really don't have. And so, for instance, the third-ranking officer in the State Department, Bill Burns, very fine officer who was our ambassador to Moscow at one point, our ambassador to Jordan at one point. Bill Burns remains as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, as he was for me, and so you have a lot of continuity in the Department of State, and I think the transition went very, very well indeed.
You have been as outspoken with criticism of the Obama administration as the former Bush people. Is that a decision that you made, or have you just not seen much to complain about?
Well, I feel, and I think President Bush himself probably said it best, I owe these folks my silence and my loyalty. I know what it's like to sit in that office, getting up every day, working around the clock on some of the most difficult issues, and to have people chirping at you from the sidelines. Let me just tell you, things look a lot easier out here than they do when you're in there. And so I think one of the great things about our system is that we have change. We had our 8 years. I think we did many things well. I think there are a lot of things that we could have done better. But that is behind us, and we have a new administration and new leaders who are doing their best for the country. I don't hesitate to talk about the issues and about how we might approach them. But I don't see any purpose. I think there is a certain decorum that is owed to your successors, and I'm comfortable in that role. I won't hesitate to call up somebody if I think there's something that I need to say, but I'll do that privately.
Is there a world situation that concerns you more than others, be it Afghanistan or the situation in Iran?
Yes. Well, first and foremost, we have to deal with the failed states. that are the source of so much conflict and really the source of danger to us. One of the most surprising things to me when I entered government was the degree to which the threat to the United States didn't come from powerful states, it came from failed states, and the quintessential failed state was Afghanistan. I know how hard it is in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the 5th poorest country in the world. It has basically no road network except what we've built. It has very little electricity outside of Kabul. It's a complicated tribal place that has always been very decentralized, and so it's very hard. And I know, and it has the unfortunate geography of very high mountains and a border with Pakistan in an area of Pakistan that's ungoverned, the northwest frontier area. So it was always going to be hard, but we can't afford to lose patience with Afghanistan. So because I think it is still potentially, it isn't as it was before 9/11, but it is still potentially the greatest safe haven for terrorists. I think this is something that we have to deal with. I worry some about the border with Mexico. That is an area that also has certain characteristics of a failed state that is not really strong government control. The Mexicans experienced 5,000 assassinations and kidnappings last year of officials. And the Calderon government, which is a very good government, has reached out to the United States, did to the Bush administration. I know that the Obama administration is continuing to work with them to train the Army and the police to try to deal with the drug cartels there. But Juarez and Tijuana, which used to be cities that Americans went to across the border easily, are places that you would not want to go now. And so I worry some about that as well. But I think our primary concern has to be to get Afghanistan and Pakistan right. And of course, you've been reading a lot recently about Yemen, which has also some of the characteristics of state failure, ungoverned territories. So there's plenty to do in that regard, but the number one security threat on the foreign policy side really is the existence of these failed states, and they have to be healed, and that's hard work, and it's dangerous work. It takes a lot of resources and a lot of patience.
Would you talk a little bit about what you think about the use of timelines and how that might affect diplomacy, if it makes it more difficult? Just what your thoughts are.
Right. Well, it depends. In general, I'm not much for timelines because you find that when the end comes, that perhaps something is progressing a little bit and you don't want to blow the whistle, and pretty soon you've issued timeline after timeline and nothing has happened, which I think is a problem for credibility. But I think it's less important whether or not you have a timeline than whether you have a strategy at the end of whatever period you've declared. And in regards to the Afghanistan engagement, what I heard President Obama say was that 18 months dependent on conditions on the ground. Now, I probably would have said dependent on conditions on the ground, but I think that shows that nobody wants to be in a position of having issued a hard timeline, which then would cause you to uproot your policy when it's working. And so timelines are sort of a double-edged sword. I don't myself care much for them, but they creep into foreign policy and they creep into diplomacy. It's just the nature of the beast.
How important is it that we find yet Osama bin Laden?
Well, there are people out there searching for him every day. He and his lieutenant, Zawahiri, are obviously symbolically important, and they're important to the movement as symbols and as rallying points. I do think that it's easy to become too focused on a single individual when really what has hurt al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda has been hurt, what has hurt al-Qaeda is taking out that whole rung of their, I will call them their field generals. People like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, like Abu Zubaydah, like Ramzi bin al-Shibh. These were the people who were really doing the plotting, the planning, the facilitating, really carrying out the plots. And by breaking up that structure, I think we've really weakened al-Qaeda. It's not the organization that it was on September 10th, and that's very good news. I also think that from the point of view of the image, if you will, of al-Qaeda, it's taken a beating. And when I hear Osama bin Laden commenting on climate change, I think something's a little strange in this organization. So we have to be vigilant. We have to keep pursuing it. I'll say tonight that one of the challenges is that we have to be right 100% of the time, and they have to be right once. And that's an unfair fight. And it means that you can never rest. I can tell you that for those of us who experienced September 11th from positions of authority, every day after that was September 12th. And that's the way you have to think about it, because they want desperately to succeed again, and the odds are they will. Right?
Dealing with airline security, of course, we had the incident before Christmas. And, in dealing with foreign governments, how easy is it to get them to go along with boosting security and keeping these people off the planes, keeping that material off?
Well, we've made a lot of progress, actually, with most countries in the world on improving airline security. Now, sometimes there are tussles and differences about exchange of passenger information and whether or not it ought to be kept confidential and so forth. But for the most part, I think it works reasonably well. And by the way, Christmas plots are not at all unheard of. I think there were 4 or 5 in the period after 9/11 before we left office, because al-Qaeda would like very much to hurt us on our big religious holiday. That would be symbolically so important. So I'm not at all surprised that this happened on Christmas. I suspect that if the pieces had been put together and that the Europeans had been asked to keep that guy off the plane, they would have done it. I don't have any doubt that they would have done it. And so it wasn't the lack of cooperation that was the problem. Now, to be sure, somebody might have noticed that he was carrying no baggage and had a one-way ticket and paid cash. That should have been a red flag someplace. But again, I don't think it was the absence of cooperation that was the problem. I think we have reasonably good cooperation. We need to work harder to, through technology, to unify the systems, airline systems worldwide. It's a funny thing. If I fly from Singapore to Beijing to San Francisco, that airline can pull up my information in any of those cities. Why shouldn't we be able to do that in the same networked way for airline security? So there's much work to do, but I don't think it really is fair to say that it's the absence of cooperation. I think people want to cooperate on this.
I think you have one more question.
Yes.
I think you have a book coming out pretty soon.
I do. Well, in the fall, I'm furiously writing the last pages as we speak. I decided to do my family memoir first. It is a book called Extraordinary Ordinary People, and it is really about my parents and my grandparents. I am very often asked, how did you become who you are? How did you do what you did? And I say you had to know John and Angelina Rice, and you had to know their bedrock belief and faith in the power of education. You had to know that they were people who believed that there was no, while you might not be able to control your circumstances, you could control your response to your circumstances, and so there were no victims. And I've often said that they raised me somehow in the teeth of segregated Birmingham. I was born in 1954, and it was I was 10 years old before we could go into a restaurant in Birmingham or stay in a hotel. But somehow, even though I couldn't have a hamburger at Woolworth's, they had me absolutely convinced that I could be president of the United States if I wanted to be. And I think it's an extraordinary story of my parents and the community in which I grew up, which was a community that produced incredibly successful kids. I'm by no means the only successful kid from Titusville, Birmingham, in Birmingham, Alabama. Most importantly, while it's a story about the segregated South and a black family in the segregated South, it's a very American story. It's one of those stories that fits into our great national belief that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. And I thought it was really important to tell that story. I will write the foreign policy memoir the last 8 years, but I think until you know that story, it's probably hard to have a context for me going forward. Thank you very much.